go. All right. What was it like being a teenager in the 1950s?
Well, it was an exciting time. The United States went through the Great Depression, and then it followed with World War II, came out victorious, the soldiers came home, things were on the upbeat. And when we were teenagers, the great thing was to have a car.
Yeah.
But it had to be a special car. You wanted something, a two-door, not a four-door, because that was your dad's car. You wanted something a little racy, and we always thought it impressed the girls, but I found out afterwards they weren't impressed at all. And
You can laugh, Grandma, it's okay.
you wanted to be cool is what we were then. It was cool, meaning that you didn't get uptight about things. And there were a lot of weird fashions, but for the most part, the teenagers didn't go for that. They pretty much stayed mainstream. Movies were things. TV was, a few homes had TV and TVs, but not a whole lot. So it was movies. It was sitting in a restaurant drinking coffee and talking with your buddies, and for maybe 2-3 hours, and so on. And we used to cruise, but it wasn't anything like the cruising in the 70s and 80s because there weren't that many of us.
By cruising, you mean like driving around?
Yeah, driving around the city of Goshen, going around. There was an area we would drive around, and that, and honk your horn at people, and wave, and so
on. Okay. Did you like listening to rock and roll? Or?
Rock and roll actually kind of came in towards the end of the 60s or the 50s.
Oh.
I know Elvis
Yeah.
was there, but he wasn't real popular with the teenagers. I think he was more popular with the young girls, and I think it was in the 60s when he really became the king.
Yeah.
In the 50s he wasn't. That was, I suppose the music we liked, the crowd I was with, was what today would be called country and western.
Oh, okay. Sweet. Did you have a television at your house?
No, there was probably less than half of the homes had TV until towards the end of the 50s, because in this area there was only, the Elkhart station came online probably in 55 maybe 54, and unless you had a big antenna, that was the only one you could get. If you had an antenna, you could maybe get South Bend. If you spent a lot of money on an antenna, you could get Chicago.
Oh.
And what I'm talking about spending money on an antenna would be like 2 weeks' wages of somebody with a very good job.
Oh, wow.
Not for the TV, just for the antenna. And then TVs were probably $200 maybe for a TV set, when $100 was very good wages.
Yeah.
So, they were expensive, and the reception wasn't good. It was much better to go to a movie than to set. Sometimes TV sets would get so snowy you would lose track of what the story, the people disappeared. So
there's the blizzard.
Yeah.
So what was Goshen like back then?
It was so different, it's hard to think of. When I was a teenager, the Goshen City Police had 2 squad cars, and then the police chief had his own personal car. But there was only 2 squad cars. There were the traffic lights. There was about 4 lights on Main Street, 1 light at 5th and Lincoln. I don't think there was a light at 3rd and Lincoln. There were no big box stores. there was 2 or 3 grocery stores uptown. There was 3 banks, I believe, uptown. There's 2. And on Saturday night was the shopping night, and the sidewalks were so, which are the same size they are today, they were so full of people that sometimes it was difficult to walk on the sidewalks. And stores were open till 9 o'clock on Saturday night, and that was the big shopping night. And there was the 2 theaters in Goshen, the little one over on Lincoln Avenue, which was no longer there, it was called the Lincoln, and they showed cowboy movies and things that appealed more to the younger set. And they would usually have double features, so you got 2 movies for the price of 1 entrance fee. The Goshen Theater then had more regular runs, and they had everything from drama to comedy, westerns, and so on. And it was a little more expensive than what the Lincoln was. But that was the big thing, going to the movies at least 1 night a week, and maybe on Friday night, after we were a little older, we would sit and talk in one of the restaurants till 1 o'clock in the morning.
So what kind of movies did you watch? Like,
I suppose I liked the movies was the war movies. I was quite fascinated with World War II, and in the 50s there was quite a few movies made about World War II. And then there was cowboy movies, and they were very expensive to make, where they would actually go out on set, and they would have the mountains or the canyons, the desert, and they were great. And then I was a science fiction fan. The one movie during the 50s that probably a lot of people in my generation saw was War of the Worlds, which was the H.G. Wells book. And they did a very good job with that.
Have you seen the new World War?
No.
Okay. So, do you remember anything about the Korean War, or?
Yes, I was 11, 12 years old when North Korea invaded South Korea. And of course, I was in school. I started in school during World War II. And by the time I could read real good, there was a lot of articles about that. So when the Korean War came, I was fascinated because this was happening now, and I remember reading everything in the Goshen News that was on the Korean War. Every night I'd pick up the paper and go and read about this war. And it was a thing. They said people got tired of it, but I think the great feeling of patriotism probably was very, very strong. Maybe not as strong as it had been in World War II, because I don't remember when that started, but the Korean War, it was just, they were bad and we were the good guys, and there just was no question about that.
Like, some of the things I learned in history was that when some of the soldiers came back, they didn't get, like, the big greeting that the World War II soldiers got. Do you remember that?
I don't think it was as pronounced, because there probably was a little more, now not in this area so much, but there was a little more anti-war feeling. It was a little more pronounced. There was anti-war feeling in World War II, but it was all kept, nobody wanted to admit that they were that. It was all kept very, very, very low. Korean wasn't probably quite as much, and one of the things was that the Korean War is it got the stalemate, where the war just stayed in this one area and moved very little. And that's, the soldiers, the North Koreans were here, and the Chinese were here, and the South Koreans, US were here, and they just they finally started talking, and they talked, I think, maybe for a year or so before there was finally a truce. And so it was, for the people that were strong patriots, that was a little bit of a bad thing to not end the war.
Yeah.
You know, World War II ended in
1945.
victory.
Yeah.
It was, just absolute victory.
Yeah.
You know, there was, and Korean War didn't.
Yeah. Do you remember? Do you remember feeling like mad or anything when I think it was President Truman fired General McCarthy, or not? No, General MacArthur.
MacArthur.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I was not old enough to know for sure. Some of the adults thought Truman shouldn't, and some of the adults thought he should have. Actually, what people don't realize is Truman's approval ratings at that time were less than President Bush's are today.
Wow.
So he was not a very popular president. And should he have fired MacArthur or not, today they're still debating that.
Yeah. So do you remember anything about Joseph McCarthy and how he accused a whole bunch of people?
Yeah, I remember that. And of course, communism was considered very evil in the 50s. It was very bad. So probably I would have sided in with McCarthy, but then I remember some of the politicians that I respected refused to have anything to do with him.
Oh.
And I remember when Adlai Stevenson ran against Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952, when Truman didn't run.
Yeah.
And Joseph McCarthy said he was going to expose Adlai Stevenson in a speech on the Senate floor, and then nobody would vote for him. And I remember reading an article in the newspaper a few days later, and somebody said like this, I don't know who wrote it, it said, McCarthy made his speech, and guess what? The world's still here. It didn't come to an end. And then I began to see what he was, a lot of talk, a lot of hype, and not near as much substance as what he had led people to believe.
Yeah. That's how I felt about it. I wasn't there. So you basically, you thought communism was like totally evil. You didn't have any doubts about it.
It was not. Yeah, there wasn't. It was just a scheme to take over the world.
Okay. Do you remember doing any duck and cover drills?
No, we didn't do it. We had fire drills.
Oh.
We didn't do the bomb fear came in the 60s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in the 50s, even though the Russians had developed the bomb, and that did scare people a little, and they had developed the bomb by stealing the secrets from the United States, but there were people in the U.S. that actually helped them, people in the government even. They thought, well, this was the way to keep from having, if they had the bomb and we had the bomb, then it'd be, what do they call it, mutual assured destruction.
Oh, yeah.
The interesting thing is, on the bombs, you realize the United States is the only nation that ever dropped the bomb in the war.
Really?
The two that were dropped in World War II. Now, you can call the U.S. evil for that, or you can think, wait a minute. That was over 50 years ago. In those intervening 50 years, there has not been one bomb dropped in war. So I would say the safety record is very good.
Yeah.
And it would appear the U.S. government was a very good custodian of this terrible weapon.
Yeah. Do you remember the start of the space race when?
Yes, I definitely remember the U.S. sent up rocket ships. They would, I don't think any blowed up on the launch pad, but they would blow up before they got into orbit, and I don't think they ever got a successful one before the Russians launched their Sputnik.
Yeah.
And the Sputnik made I don't know how many orbits and sent back radio signals. And I remember being in a movie theater. See, this would have been during Eisenhower's first administration. And there was a newsreel. That was the thing they had in the movie theaters, and newsreels, because not very many people had TV, and especially in an area like this, reception wasn't real good, so they had newsreels in there. And I remember making a big thing over the United States had sent something up on a rocket and retrieved it. And that was something that nobody else had ever done. Anything that went up, then it was destroyed when it came back in. And I don't know if there was any significance in that or not. But that was in the early 50s, or late 50s, that was the thing that, oh my goodness, the Russians are way ahead of us in this rocket race, and their technology is way beyond ours, and so on. That was going strong in the 60s, but it began there in the 50s, in the late 50s.
Yeah, I always thought it was kind of strange, like when my teacher told us that they just sent up a rocket up there that all it did was like send signals back.
Yeah.
And I was like, what's the big deal of that?
But it was a prestige. It was the same thing that, wow, look what our rockets did.
Yeah.
And actually what happened, the United States was really decades ahead of the Russians on technology. But what the Russians did is they took all of their effort into just getting one satellite up there and having an orbit for the prestige thing. The United States was trying to develop rockets that were more efficient, more controllable, and so on, and it was quite evident by the end of the 60s that the U.S. was way ahead, because, see, the Russians put the first man in space also, but then the Russians didn't have to worry about if they had a failure, they could pretty well cover it up.
Yeah.
Whereas the United States had a failure, the reporters were all there, so.
Yeah. Free speech.
Yeah.
Or freedom of press.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember anything about the early civil rights movement?
Oh yes, I remember very much reading this, and it was inspiring, because it started with this Rosa Parks, and she was a working mother that lived in, I'm not sure now if it was Selma or Montgomery, but it was in Alabama.
Yeah.
And the buses there were divided. Half of the bus, the back half was for the Negroes, the front half was for the whites. And incidentally, they weren't, around here, they were referred to as the colored folks. It was considered derogatory to use black.
Yeah.
And even Negro wasn't considered very high class, so, but more of the colored folks rode the bus than white. So those seats would be filled, but the white seats wouldn't, so they had to stand. Well, she was a working mother. She had worked all day. She was tired. There was an empty seat. She sat down. Well, then some man got on, and he went and told her to get up. I want to sit here. Well, there was lots of other seats to sit, but she was in the white section. She refused. So he complained to the driver. The driver stopped and told her, you have to move, and she wouldn't do it. So they called a policeman, and he arrested her. Took her to jail. I mean, think how terrible this was, to take this poor white man's seat. He could have sat anywhere in the bus. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the blacks, this was outrage, and it caused it. They made sure this got in the news. It caused some outrage in the North. Well, then what they did, they said, all right, all of the blacks, let's not ride the bus. So these buses rode around this town empty, because they didn't have, and incidentally, the blacks sat in the back of the bus, but they didn't pay less money. They paid the same money as the others. And finally, the bus company, without any Supreme Court, no government, They said, blacks, you can get on the bus and sit wherever you want. They could not afford to run the buses without the blacks. And I just think that everybody in the North that wasn't a racist applauded, because I thought this was great. And I remember then they would talk, as I had made a trip at the end of the 50s down into the South. And it was unbelievable. The paved streets stopped at the end of the white district, and they were dirt streets.
Oh.
Some didn't have sewer lines or water lines. And I remember I was telling me that the libraries in most of these southern cities were paid for with sales tax, but the blacks were not permitted to use the library.
Wow.
You know, and this was just so, there was nothing separate but equal about it. And I remember being at a gas station, and I was traveling with somebody else. We pulled in there, filled up with gas, and then I looked, and there was a men's and women's restrooms. And then there was a sign that said colored, and an arrow pointing. It was round, you could see on the back. And there was a dirt path that was muddy and a big mud puddle to go through to get to that. And then I looked, and I really wanted to ask the station attendant, but I didn't. Being a teenager, I wasn't just bold enough. Where's the colored pump? Since they have a separate restroom, I would think there'd be a pump here and they'd pay less money. But I wasn't bold enough to say that.
Oh.
So I was just, that was my thing on that. And I never met any black people until, if I'm not mistaken, I was 10 or 11 years old, and my parents got acquainted with a black family. And they were with us sometimes, and then I saw how people couldn't treat them the same. So I guess I had a very early indoctrination into what racism was about, looking at people as inferior.
So, there weren't really very many African American families here.
There was no blacks lived in Goshen. Of course, we lived out in the country then.
Yeah.
But Elkhart had some blacks. But there were restaurants in Elkhart that the blacks could come in and buy food and take it out. They couldn't sit down and eat it. And there were areas where if a black went to buy a home, the real estate dealer wouldn't sell it to him if he came in. There were areas in Elkhart where they wouldn't let them buy homes.
Wow.
So it was very, very unfair. And I used to think, man, if somebody would have taken the church my parents belonged to and said, everybody that's in this church, you can't go in this restaurant and eat. You can't buy a house over here. You can't use the restrooms. You can't go into the library. I would have been a rebel. So I could understand the feeling in the young blacks.
Okay, this last question's weird. But do you remember going to McDonald's and buying hamburgers for 15 cents?
We went to Elkhart one time when the first McDonald's was over there. It was just a little building, golden arches, and a window. No place to sit down. The only inside was where they fixed the food and things. And we had heard about this, but this is the first one I'd ever seen. And I don't remember who was with me for sure. But we went and bought something, but I cannot remember to this day what. But I was quite fascinated by this place that was serving, I think, just burgers and shakes and probably fries, I suppose. There was just a very limited menu, and they had benches out in front then that you could sit down and eat your things on. That was the first McDonald's, and I didn't know anything about it, but we were just fascinated by looking at it. But I remember them being very cheap. I couldn't have said what the price was, but in the 50s, a bottle of pop out of a vending machine at a filling station was 5 cents.
Wow.
Candy bars were 5 cents or 10 cents. 25 cents would get you a huge candy bar. 55 cents would get you into the theater.
That would be nice.
Hamburgers at a regular restaurant were anywhere from 40 to 50 cents. Coffee was a nickel a cup, nickel or a dime, depending where you went. So $1 could get you hamburgers, fries, and a Coke, I think, at most restaurants.
Yeah.
But you might work for $1.25 an hour too. Especially if you were a teenager trying to get a job, you know, if you weren't a skilled worker.
Yeah. Did you buy your own car or did you have
Yes.
one? You did?
My father, the first car I bought with cash I had. The second car, I had to borrow money and my dad signed for me. And then I made the payments, but I had to be able to show him that the paycheck that I got would have enough money to make the payments and have a little money on gas. I had learned that it wasn't any point in going to him if I couldn't make the payments, he wasn't going to sign. And so I remember the first car I bought money was after trying to talk him into letting me buy a couple other cars and he wouldn't sign for me. But I had all my homework done and I showed him how much money I made, how much my paycheck would be, and how much the car payment would be, and I'd have this much money left over, and he agreed to sign, and that was how I got my first good car with a bank loan.
Was the first car you bought, was it a used car? Or?
Yeah, they were all used cars.
Oh, okay.
I never bought a new car until I was married many, many years.
In the autumn years, right?
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell me?
I have to think about, there'd be some things that were unique about the 50s. There was so much different. Like I say, not every home had TVs, and it wasn't, some was because of religion, but a lot of it was just simply because without spending a lot of money, reception wasn't good. Two-car families were very rare. A lot of people, unless you had a little better than an average job, you may not even buy a new car. Most kids worked after school of some job or other. There was a few kids that didn't have to, their parents had money. It was rare that teenagers that got enough money from their folks to run around and go to movies and things was a little bit rare. Most of them had to get out and earn money, and some people went to school and even worked full-time factory jobs at night.
Wow.
It was, the regulations were a little bit less stringent than they are now. You had to get a work permit, but it was easier to get, and so forth. And it was, you weren't supposed to operate machinery, but I had a job at 17, and I operated machinery that I wasn't supposed to, and nobody said anything about it. So
You're like, we don't see.
yeah.
So, where was your first job? Do you remember?
Yeah, I worked part-time in a little metal stamping factory that my dad worked at, and I would work just when they needed help. And then the first full-time job that I had was in a plating factory, where we did chrome and copper and things like. You took base metal that people would, like flower pots, and went them through this process and plated them so they were copper colored or brass colored, and parts for lamps. We didn't make any finished product. We only made we plated the parts for people that made household decorations and things like that that are copper, and that was the first full-time job I had.
And when did you meet Grandma?
Actually, the first time when I was about 5 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know who she was, but her parents moved down from Wisconsin, and they lived in with her uncle until they could get a place to live. And I don't remember what, they probably had to do something in their house to have room for them or something, because the church people all went over there on a work day. And of course, I was just a little kid running around, and here was these strange people from Wisconsin, and she was one of them.
Oh. So, did you know each other for a long time before you got married?
Yeah, we since our parents attended the same church, we kind of grew up together. And she was even in my class for a little while in high school, but she didn't pay me much attention. I tried to get her to, but she didn't.
Your protests. Uh, well,
I guess one thing I want to say about the 50s is we were rebels like teenagers tend to be, but we'd have been upset if somebody would have suggested that America was a bad country. And it was a funny thing because we might criticize the president, we might criticize the businesses and everything, but we were Americans and proud of it.
yeah. I kind of wish that was still, in this era.
It was such an interesting era. It was so interesting.
What would you say is the most interesting event or like something that happened in history that you thought was most interesting in the 50s?
Well, I think the civil rights movement and the fact that even though there was a lot of trouble, that the nation didn't fall apart over this.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of people in the North that were racist too. But when it came right down to it, there was enough people who wanted to do the right thing that kept the fabric of the nation together. There was always the rabble-rousers on both sides who are more interested in raising in the trouble and commotion and everything you raised than in what they believed. But in the 50s, it seemed to me the saner heads prevailed. And the people I still admire is Martin Luther King, this solution, let's quit riding the bus. And they walked, they carpooled. There was even some whites that helped the Negroes to get to work, but they had to be careful about this. Yeah. And there were people, this was an interesting thing, there were people told of what dire consequences there were going to be if they didn't keep the races separate. I often wondered, since some of those people, most of them are dead and gone now, but some of them would be the age I am now.
Yeah.
And I would almost like to ask them did these dire consequences happen?
Yeah.
Your state's wealthier today than it ever hoped to be then. Your economy is better. Your cities are better. There's some bad things, but there's a lot of things been very good. So, did they or didn't they?
I'm going to say they didn't, but that's my young teenage.
It's just obviously this was the thing that I thought, why wouldn't you let the kids go to school together?
So you remember the Brown versus the Board of Education?
Yeah, I remember that. And I remember being very happy. And incidentally, when people talk about it, that was during the Eisenhower administration. And Eisenhower he didn't want to stir up all the controversy that would happen out of this, so he tried to stay out of it. But once that ruling was passed, and then the state of Arkansas, and that's where it was at, said, no, we will not let the students in. And Eisenhower said, President, I will see that the federal laws are enforced, and he sent the National Guard there, and the students went into the school. So I think he showed his integrity there.
It's like he really wanted to uphold the law,
yeah,
but upholding the law doesn't, it's not as controversial as, you know, his own opinion, 'cause it's a law.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was his opinion on it didn't, that was kind of, it was my opinion on this doesn't matter, this is federal law, and my administration is pledged to support federal law. And I am sure if he didn't support this, then he didn't realize how bad the schools were.
Yeah. Um, did you follow the civil rights movement through the 60s?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I followed it and talked with people that were involved, read books that I could get, tried to read books on both sides.
Yeah.
And, there was no way that any reasonable person could defend the white supremacist movement.
Yeah.
There is no way. No matter whether you thought things should be separate or whatever, it was just, there was no way you could follow this. Nobody, no reasonable thinking person, no fair-minded person could have supported that position.
Yeah.
The Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I guess, I hope this interview is successful for you and you get an excellent grade.
Me too.